Welcome to a special virtual edition of the Skeptics track at Dragoncon. And now, your host, Angie Matkey.
Hello and welcome to the live streaming Skeptrack for Dragoncon 2020. I'm your Assistant Director, Angie Matkey, Dr. Angie. Today we have with us Derek Ellington, who is Digital Forensics Examiner, and he's going to talk to us all about TikTok. I don't really understand it, but I can't wait to hear about it. Hi, Derek. Welcome.
Hi, Angie. Glad to be here with you guys, and so glad to be a part of Virtual Dragoncon. I also want to say that the work that Derek and Mark and yourself did putting all this together, it's really awesome, and I look forward to seeing all you guys back again next year in person.
Can't wait. Oh, I really can't wait. So tell us about TikTok.
Well, so in the past, we've talked about things like hacking in popular culture. We talked last year about death and your digital legacy. We've even delved into investigating the millennial mind. And what we're going to talk about this time, it's called TikTok, from controversy to COVID. And if this was actually a TikTok video, it would be over by now. But the first question I would have is if there's anybody out there who doesn't have teenagers or preteens and doesn't know what TikTok is, I'll ask for a show of hands, even though I can only see my my crowd here, my very socially distant appropriate crowd who is here with me. So what is TikTok? Well, if you haven't experienced the cultural phenomenon of TikTok yet, it's basically like a YouTube where users can create videos, they can upload the videos, obviously watch and search videos, with a couple of interesting changes. One is that most of the videos are geared for being very small, 6 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, which changes some of the dynamic. First of all, TikTok is not monetized quite the same way as YouTube is. There's still a lot of opportunity for people to make money through TikTok, through sponsorships and collecting followers and stuff. And it still has that same YouTube dynamic as far as collecting, subscribers and having likes and things like that. But one of the other interesting concepts when you limit it in time is that you take away the need for some of the high production values that you get with YouTube. And YouTube has become so monetized that a lot of times to break through, you need the flashy graphics, you need the intros, the outros, things like that. When you're dealing with something as limited as TikTok, it is what it is, Again, the overwhelming majority of the videos are going to be preteens and teenagers dancing to pop music and doing dance routines and things like that. But there are people and groups who are trying to put actual content, but packaged very succinctly into TikTok. But let's get into TikTok though, because it's been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of controversy, and for most people, they didn't really pay much attention to TikTok until there was a controversy. Mm-hmm. So TikTok was actually founded in 2012 in China. It was a company called Douyin, but it didn't really take off until about 2016 when it became part of a company called ByteDance. It's a very famous media company in China, and it came to the United States in 2018 as TikTok. Now, for most people, other than it being something that their kids spend a lot of time on, or every once in a while there'd be a bit of news where some video went viral because it started on TikTok, that was the most they'd heard about it until on August 6th, President Trump signed an executive order effectively calling for the ban of TikTok in the United States. And that seemed a very extreme measure for something that most people akin to just being another Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. But TikTok, even though it had only come to the United States in 2018, sort of got on the radar pretty quickly and got in trouble pretty quickly. In February of 2019, the Federal Trade Commission actually fined the company $6 million for violating something that we call COPPA. Now, there's a rule in the United States. It's called the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act. And what that law does is it it places penalties on service providers like Facebook and everything from Steam and Gmail to Instagram and Twitter. And what it says is that you have to put protections in place to make sure that inappropriate or harmful material is not being put out in front of kids under the age of 13. That is why, and something we talked about in the Millennial Mind Talk, the terms of service for most things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter says you have to be 13 years old in order to have an account. And that is to protect the content provider, because if you're under 13, they can't get in trouble because you're violating their terms of service. Well, TikTok was being clearly marketed toward and wasn't placing limitations on people under the age of 13, and yet there was a lot of problems with their access to inappropriate material, lack of filtering, stuff like that. So that was early on in their United States experience. They were already getting in trouble. But also early in 2019, what kind of put TikTok on the radar as far as privacy advocates in the government was that the American president of TikTok, and let's just keep that in mind, that it's sort of being run as a separate company. And when Donald Trump and people like that criticized TikTok's relationship to China, they made a big deal about the fact that, well, their American subsidiary was being run independently in America. Well, the problem was in 2019, the American president of TikTok basically put out in front of their investors that part of their goal was to strengthen their ties with China and their connections with China. And actually, in TikTok's terms of service, it says, by the way, we might share your data with China, even though part of their protestations lately has been that they're not sharing your data with China. So when we talk about, so why, what data are we talking about? Why should I be worried about TikTok sharing my dance videos? If people in China want to see me dance, to Cardi B, then that's fine. Well, it comes down to the kind of information that they're collecting, okay? In the case of TikTok, there was concerns raised because when you install the app and you or your children are using the app, it says, we can collect information such as your location, okay? Your IP address, which kind of uniquely identifies you while you're on the internet. Your contacts, which we've all seen that. We've seen that an app that we install will mine our contacts in order to send our information to other people like, hey, Derek's using TikTok, you should sign up as well. But they also talk about accessing keystrokes, which is a very big gray area, right? I mean, keystrokes is a lot of things. And then obviously it wants to give you access, give itself access to your media. Well, but why still is that a problem? Because Facebook does that. Instagram does that. Don't most of the programs that we install do that? And they do. And that's why, the tech digital forensics guy in me has to warn you, once again, when you install apps, it's very important to look at what kind of permission you give that app. And in fact, most phones, iPhones, Android phones, you can go into the settings and you can see what permissions you've given apps. And if there's a game or something and it's got permission to read your contacts, or some other thing and it's got permission to read your text messages, you might want to look at whether you should use that app or whether you can manually adjust those. So again, why is TikTok a problem if they're asking for the same bits of information that other apps like Facebook and Instagram are? So why is it a problem? Well, it seems that some of the problem comes into the fact that TikTok is so closely ingrained with China, and that China has a long history of not really doing a good job when it comes to privacy. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about here, is why that's important and why we should be concerned. For example, when the word came out that TikTok was capturing the information we talked about, such as location information, things like that, there was a concern that if China had that information, they could use it strategically. Okay, well, how do you strategically use information. Now, service providers like TikTok and Facebook say, well, we collect all this location information, but we don't use it to target you individually. We use it for large-scale marketing and stuff. But now some of that information has interesting uses. For example, people studying COVID were able to take cell phone data of the people who attended Sturgis. And when I say people, they didn't have the individual people, but they had the location records for 200,000 cell phones, and they were able to track where people went after Sturgis. And I think one of the statistics I saw was that 60% of the counties in the United States had somebody come back to them from Sturgis. That was an example, and contact tracing and stuff, that's an example of what that cell data is being used for. Well, let's talk about strategically. Let's take an example where I don't know individually who these people are, but I have a large pool of cell phone users who are located near a Navy base in San Diego, okay? And then all of a sudden I don't have any location information for those people, but 5 days later, those same cell phones show up in Hawaii. And they're in Hawaii for a few days. And then they disappear again. And then they show up in Guam 6 or 7 days later. You see, and now all of a sudden I know who's in a Navy, what kind of, that they're traveling and they're going from Navy base to Navy base. That's an oversimplification, but that was one of the concerns that was raised in how a bad actor could use this information. All right, so one of the defenses that TikTok has come up with is that they've said, well, no, we don't share information with the Chinese government, even though we've reserved the right to in our terms of services. And they've even said that, well, our servers are in the United States and all of your data is in the United States. But it was interesting because during the testimony for Facebook, when Facebook, and everybody remembers Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of Congress, but there were other Facebook people who testified. And one of the Facebook engineers was asked a question about data security and this and that and the other. And he said, they said, well, where are the servers located? He said, where the servers located. He said, well, where are the engineers? Where are the developers? If you want to know where the data really is, look and see where the developers are. And unfortunately, as much as TikTok talks about the servers being located in the United States, their developers and their engineers are all in China. And you can't develop the software and engineer the software without having access to that data. And so if we're talking about China having access to that data, again, why is that a problem? Well, first of all, China, unfortunately, has a long and, shall we say, soiled history of privacy and how they handle privacy and dissent and surveillance. In fact, one of the statistics I saw is that China has an estimated 180 million government-controlled cameras monitoring its population. In fact, the Uyghur Muslims, there's a lot in the news about the Chinese oppressing those people and genocide that's happening there. They are using all kinds of surveillance, internet surveillance, all that kind of stuff, to aid in the oppression of those people. So we're talking about in 2020, China is using digital information to oppress their own people. And, so we have to be concerned that given the opportunity, they could use that information strategically. But we're going to come back to that point in a second.
Well, Derek, before you move on, I just wanted to tell you, I went through the Shanghai airport last year, and when I scanned my boarding pass, I came through, I looked up to see where my flight was, and it popped my name up on the screen with my gate and where I was heading. So anybody standing around could have seen that. And it was a little creepy. And the same thing happened to others that I was with. Their names popped up too. Now, that was really pretty disturbing. And
well, and think we're gonna come back to that because I want you to remember that point, because we're gonna come back to that in a second. But you're absolutely right. And I recently had my first case that involved having to collect some data that was located in China, located in Shanghai, from an executive of an international company. And we actually had to go through the state secrets review of the data before it could be allowed out. And again, for those of you who don't know, my job is usually, to copy computers, copy phones, copy servers, process, review the data, give it to attorneys, the courts. And in this particular case, there was an added issue of, before we could have the copies of the data that we were facilitating, the government had to review it, and you had to actually hire a law firm to review it. And the first law firm that we picked got rejected because they had an office in Hong Kong. So, but let's go back to the issue of, let's talk about China and privacy. And what's really interesting is, well, the same thing you were talking about. I had another recent case where I had to go to a Chinese American company here, and I had to copy a bunch of people's phones. And normally, if I'm going and copying somebody's phone, there's a lot of questions about privacy. Who's going to see my data? What are you going to have access to? Who does it go to? And I have to go through all my standard disclaimers about, well, I'm the only one who has this, and there's only this information. And it was interesting that the Chinese citizens, the Chinese Americans, didn't ask those kind of questions. And I didn't realize until I had done this process with about 10 of them that they weren't asking the usual questions. They wanted to know when they were going to have their phone back. They were upset that I was going to have their phone for an hour or so. And I finally got to talking to one of the guys, and they said, we automatically assume everything's being reviewed. Everything's being looked at. So I'm not worried about the privacy of my data. I know somebody's already got it somewhere. I just want my phone back. But and again, this issue of privacy and this issue of what information is collected from you is very important, and it's more important than some people think for reasons we'll get to in a second. But back in 2018, something called the GDPR went into effect in the European Union, and that was called the General Data Protection Regulation. And if you're an American, you're familiar with that, because starting about 2018, you would go to your usual websites that you normally frequented, and there might be a thing that said, hey, we use cookies. We've always used cookies to track your information, but now, because of the GDPR, we have to ask your permission or at least notify you. Or, you've seen it with a lot of other websites, and that's because if it's a company that expects anybody from the European Union to access the data, there are controls that have to be in place and acknowledgments that you have to make about how your data is being stored. But here's what's interesting. We're used to thinking about, your data. And when I say, oh, a company's got your data, you're going to think about, okay, that must mean social security numbers, driver's license, my email address, my address, things like that. It's also funny that companies will refer to the data as being your data, even though they're selling it and making money off of it. And if you're selling it and making money off of it, shouldn't I get something because it's my data? What's interesting is that the GDPR, European Union, was not only worried about the data that was overtly yours and putting controls in place like that, HIPAA and healthcare type protections for regular data. They were also concerned about what could be done with this same aggregate data, like what we were talking about, the location data. The example that we used for servicemen, perhaps their locations being tracked. Well, the European Union was also worried about that. And what they also put controls on, which is what made it way ahead of the controls anybody else is doing, is they looked at anonymized data that could somehow still be tied to you personally, okay? And now when I say that, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, if it's anonymous data, what do you mean it can still be tied to me personally? And the example that I can use, in my line of work, one of the things we run into a lot is dealing with virtual currencies like Bitcoin. Now, a lot of people will use Bitcoin and they will say, Bitcoin is anonymous. That's why I use Bitcoin, it's not trackable. And in essence, it's a virtual currency that, let's just say it's tied to a user number. So maybe you have some serial number that's your user number. That number doesn't tie back to you directly. It doesn't have your name, Angie, attached to it. It's just a number. Well, the deal is, if you do enough transactions, I can figure out sometimes who you are. And there was some very famous cases where, like, someone was using Bitcoin to purchase the illegal things, illegal weapons, drugs, illegal pornography. They were doing those kind of things with Bitcoin, thinking that it's not traceable, nobody's going to find me. And then they order a pizza from their local pizza place that takes Bitcoin. And all of a sudden, that gives us a data point because we know when the pizza was ordered, what address it was delivered to. And in that same way, is even if the data is anonymized, even if the data is not supposed to be personally identifiable, if you put enough data together, you can identify somebody. And that's why this data is so very important. And this is probably the time to interject that when the United States government told TikTok that they had to divest their U.S. system to a U.S. company, Microsoft and Walmart stood up, went into a joint partnership, and are trying to buy it for between $20 and $30 billion. Now, TikTok, like other platforms, does have advertising. But if you think that preteens and teens dancing to Cardi B is going to generate $20 to $30 billion worth of revenue, that is not what it's about. And in fact, Walmart even said they're launching their own platform to compete with Amazon Prime. And they're looking at using TikTok to launch and advertise their platform. But the data, and again, we're going to talk about that in a second, why that data is so important as well. But $20 to $30 billion for a video platform kind of tells you that we're dealing with something that's more than just videos. Let's go back, though, and let's talk about China's history with privacy and the problematic history of privacy. In the 1950s, when there was the Communist Revolution, one of the things that Chairman Mao did was they pretty much started from scratch and rewrote history. And whatever we know about the Chinese history from inside China is what they decided their history would be. And in fact, they made no bones about it, that the history of China was going to fit the communist propaganda. And historians were actually, there's a quote that was amazing, and it basically said that historians were able to write history without sources. Which flies completely contrary to what us as skeptics are supposed to do. But basically, you wrote the history, and if it was approved, then it was history. And along with that, part of what happened was the same type of surveillance state, the same type of oppression of free thought. But what was interesting, and what applies to our conversation today, is that there was a problem with that. There was too much, right? It was too oppressive. And several years after they started this program, Mao invited some of the historians and educators and people, and he invited them in, and he said, hey, something's wrong. Speak freely. Tell me what's wrong. And they all said, no, that's all right. We'll pass. He was like, no, really. And finally convinced them enough to tell them what I'm about to tell you, which is that you can go too far with privacy. With eliminating privacy. And what we're going to explain in a second is, if you look at the history of China since 1950, you will see that there is this constant compression of civil rights and compression of liberty and privacy, and then an expansion, and then a compression again, and then Tiananmen Square, and then they keep open. And what happens is China is stuck in this cycle of kind of increased pressure on its citizens and then releasing the pressure. And there's a reason, right? A lot of times when we talk about privacy, especially in the United States, people will say, well, I don't have anything to hide. I'm not worried about privacy. So what if I don't have privacy? What's the big deal? Or they think that, oh, well, privacy, leads to bad things. It's the devil's workplace, right? But here's the interesting thing about privacy, and if there's always in my talks, I always say, if there's the one thing that you remember from the talk, this is what I want you to remember. And that is, here's the thing about privacy. Governments and corporations and even religions have three goals, okay? And their goals are self-perpetuation, right? Expansion, and profit. I mean, we can pretty much agree that that's the three things that most governments and corporations and even religions are interested in, right? Well, the number one factor in all of those things is predictability, okay? You need predictability in order to do those things. For example, how much taxes are we going to collect? How many cars do we need to build? How many births are there going to be? How many baptisms are there going to be, right? You need predictability. The way you get predictability is the more data you have. The more data you can collect on your population, the more predictable it is. However, that comes with a price, because to get the data that you really want, you have to encroach on privacy. So, and the funny thing about that is that oftentimes what's best short term for governments and religions and corporations is actually bad for everybody long term. And that's because, and here's the takeaway, privacy is important, because without privacy, you don't have innovation, you don't have creativity, and you don't have that same kind of economic growth. And that's what the Chinese kept figuring out and forgetting over the course of 50 years, is that if they cracked down too much on free thought, then there was no innovation. People were, a manufacturing process and somebody knew a better way, they were afraid to talk. I mean, we can think of, art and music and stuff like that, but there's also science. And when we're talking about the things that you're worried about for privacy, it's not just your text messages and your selfies. It's ideas for companies, ideas for improvement, ideas for business. And if there's not that sense of privacy and the fact that I can at least think about these things, then you don't see the same type of innovation and creativity and economic growth. This is also a time to interject that one of our partners for Dragoncon is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And if privacy is important to you, and if you're a free thinker and you're part of Skeptrack, then privacy needs to be very important to you. Then being understanding and supporting the work that EFF is doing is also very important, because they are on the forefront of our battle for privacy. So here's the thing, and this is back to your trip to the airport. So Angie, let's talk about what happened to you when you were in the airport. So as much as China, over the course of, like we said, the last 60, 70 years, has struggled with being too oppressive and then figuring out it's a problem and having to lighten up and figuring out it's, and then going back and forth, they're trying to do it again. And what they're trying to do now is arguably scarier and more insidious than anything they've ever done. And it's what they call the Golden Shield Project. And in essence, and you may have heard some of this about the news, it's basically you accrue, for lack of a better term, social points, right? Social standing. If you do good things and don't do bad things, you get social points. The less waves you make, the more you're a good worker, a good citizen, pay your taxes, whatever. Don't do the skeptical things we do at Dragoncon. You get plenty of social points. Which is completely opposite, right, of the way we do things.
I'm
and
going
how
down
we
in
consider
flames after this weekend.
Exactly how we consider social points. This is not how we accrue social points. But they have algorithms, and they've invested so much money not only into the surveillance state to collect all this information, to collect the emails, to collect the internet traffic, to collect the text messages, the conversation histories, but they have artificial intelligence algorithms, and this is not the conspiracy theory stuff. This is stuff that China is actually very proud of.
Oh yeah.
They give you point levels, and they determine how good of a citizen you are based on all of these factors and variables that they put together. And then the point levels are what you need for jobs, or to have children, or educational opportunities, housing, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So the question is, why should we be worried about China having the data? Well, first of all, because China can't be trusted with the data. I mean, that has to be the takeaway when you look at what they're doing with the data to oppress their own people, and then also to basically, we all had that college professor who would give you the grade down to 4 or 5 decimal places. And in essence, that's what China is doing with the social score, with the Golden Shield social score, is to have a numeric value on how good of a citizen you are, and that value translates into your rights as a citizen. But here's what's important. Isn't that the same thing that Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are doing? I mean, they're collecting the same information, right? Can they not be trusted as well? Well, the good thing about the backlash against TikTok is that at least the backlash against TikTok is setting a baseline. All right. I mean, the tech companies, the governments, we'll probably do a session sometime on what happened with the NSA and Eric Snowden and all that kind of stuff. But the key is the government and these corporations have run rampant with privacy and data collections for so long that the fact that we actually now have some baseline. So we've actually seen, okay, there is a point at which we've now in agreement that this is bad. So maybe once we've established that point, we can start working, backwards. We can start saying, okay, well, now that we've established this is the worst case scenario, hey, these other things aren't so great either. So I guess that brings up the question. And the question would be, does that mean I need to stop using TikTok? Or maybe a better way to say the question is, oh, please don't make me stop my children from using TikTok because it's giving me some peace because they've got something to do during quarantine because they can make their videos and occupy their time. And I don't think that's the answer. I don't think, not using the platforms are the answer. I think being aware of the risk that you take and the information that you give up, being aware of the permissions that you give apps, I think that's very important. I think that not letting that lull you into a sense that your privacy is not important. Your privacy is way more important, not only your privacy, but how your privacy and your sense of the importance of privacy fits into the larger picture. So I guess what I'm saying is your privacy is important, not just for you, but because of everybody else. Everybody else's privacy for the benefit of our country and economic growth and art and science, that's very important. So, and I guess just before we kind of switch gears a little bit, are there any questions or anything that we need to cover from there?
I was just wondering, you're talking about this oscillation between privacy and lack thereof. Does that shift the Overton window about what's tolerated in general? Like, do they generally shift more towards, instead of clamping all the way back down, do they clamp down not quite as hard or not open up quite as much? I mean, like, is it tending to shift one way or the other?
And that's a good question. And I think the way we have to look at it is, of course, especially when you're talking about China, it is relevant. Excuse me, not relevant. Well, it's relevant as well. It's relative because, I mean, we're talking about a slight loosening in China is still what we would consider, crazy oppressive, but just even little adjustments make a big difference. And when you're talking about, a culture of over a billion people. And, one of the statistics I forgot to mention was that this TikTok app has only been relevant in America for about 2 years now, but there's an estimated 80 million people using it. Worldwide, the app has been downloaded over 1 billion times with over 800 million users. You want to think about collecting data and you want to talk about, developing predictability. There's your sample size, and it's only increasing. But you're right. For people who live under a regime like China, it may only be small changes, but they can have huge impacts, or in essence, it can be seen as huge swings back and forth their way. Yes.
Okay. While we're still waiting for questions to come in for those on the live stream, we are taking live questions. Please feel free to ask at any point. Derek, so you were gonna say something?
Well, absolutely. And one of the things you brought up the point too, when we're talking about kind of the different levels of privacy and stuff like that. And I always want to remind people about the whole lobster pot adage about, putting the lobster in the cold water and slowly bringing the water up till it's boiling. And I think that that's the risk that we take when we're dealing with questions of privacy. And when we let applications or governments or corporations, death by a thousand cuts us. When they take little tiny baby steps, and they take one little piece of privacy away, or they get one little piece of information here that they shouldn't have, and over time, all of a sudden, we've lost all of it because they've taken it away so incrementally. And I think we need to be conscious of that and make sure that we're not, we're not going to wake up one day and be boiling. But one of the things that I mentioned in the description is, now that we kind of have a better understanding of TikTok as far as the privacy and cultural stuff, how does that play into the stuff that we talked about with the investigating the millennial mind? And for the Skeptrack followers out there, I think it's awesome what Skeptrack is doing, and Mark and his team getting the historical videos out onto YouTube so people can watch them. And hopefully soon we'll have the millennial mind video out there, which I think everybody will enjoy. And what we talk about in that video is how our connection with technology and how technology provides, notifications and feedbacks and likes and upvotes, and how that kind of connection releases the same kind of dopamines in your system that a drug would, and how it fuels that addiction to technology that, of course, people either make money off of or use to influence the way you think or how you vote and things like that. And again, corporations and media companies using algorithms to troll us, to point us or sway us. The Russian interference is a real thing as far as, swaying news articles and stuff like that. The key is, we talked about how much of an impact this has on us. And one of the problems with TikTok is that it is becoming kind of the higher evolution of this kind of technology. That, it's one thing when we're several minute long or 30-minute long videos or news articles and stuff like that, and then we get that response, or there's a notification every few minutes or whatever when we post something. But when you're talking about 6-second, 10-second, 30-second videos, and then you're looking at another one and you're looking at another one and stuff like that, it's really fueling that short attention span, that dopamine response, instant gratification thing, to the point where even TikTok, that's the shocking thing, is that they've even realized it's a problem. When the bartender who is paid to serve you alcohol says, dude, you've had enough, you need to stop, that's kind of a sign there's a problem. And TikTok is actually working things into their platform now because of the concerns that were raised. And also because I think there's a recognition that if they don't try to be somewhat responsible and enact their own controls, they're going to have controls enacted on them. But they're putting things in place where, it encourages you to take a break after a certain amount of time, or if you watch so many videos in a row and stuff like that. But at the same time, that's almost the direction we're going with everything. I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a new media platform they're pushing. I think it's called QB, and it's kind of like Netflix, and it's got all these TV shows and things like that, but they're all 10 minutes or less. So it's Netflix with nothing but 10-minute TV shows, because that's about as long as they think that our attention can last,
well, they may not
which
be
is pretty
wrong.
crazy.
They may not be wrong. We do have a question here. Regarding your commentary on TikTok privacy issues setting a baseline for legislative action in the future, do you think Facebook should be broken up or treated like a public utility?
And that's the problem. I agree that Facebook as a media company has way too much power. However, I also concede that it is a lot of power that we have delegated to them, that we've given up to them in a way maybe even unwarranted. So they have way too much control over our information because we've let them have too much control over our information. But to go back to what we talked about, like I said, in the Millennial Mind, how and predictability. When we talk about, predictability is profitability. They want to make us predictable. And the way companies like Facebook, they want to sell us. They want to sell, like Angie. They want to sell you to an advertiser, right?
Depends on how much they're going to pay.
Right, exactly right. They want to sell you to an advertiser, so an advertiser can advertise to you. But you're not an easy person to sell. You're a very complex person. Like, a lot of your viewpoints may be kind of gray here and there, and I'm kind of in the middle. But you understand what I'm saying? There's very few people who are just 100% black and white on topics. We're thoughtful people and stuff like that. And so to sell you to an advertiser so that the advertiser can specifically target you, the media company needs to package you as specific as possible. They can't just say, well, she likes this sometimes, she likes that sometimes. No, they need to very much specifically define you. Well, the problem is that's not easy to do. Like, it's not easy for me to define you. It's a lot easier for me to make you who I want you to be. So what happens is I start giving you a series of choices, and I start influencing the information that I present to you. And based on those choices, I am narrowing you down to a very specific viewpoint. You're pro this, you're against that. You're for, because of the information that I'm feeding you. And at the end of the day, what do I have? Then I have somebody that I can package. And that's what they're doing. And the problem is we're letting them do that by not recognizing the fact that they're going into an echo chamber. I guess one example too is, I have so many people that say, hey, what happened to my relative? Like, they have this viewpoint that I never thought they had in all these years, and they were never like this, and I never realized they were like this. And I said, there is a good chance that they weren't like this, that they have been honed and sharpened and channeled into being this very specific person. And so to go back to the question, should Facebook be broken up? I don't know. But I know that there needs to be more controls in place. We need to be more responsible with how we use the platforms. We need to find ways to recognize it. I do believe that some of the things that they're doing with, what they're finally doing, after a congressional hearing, what was it? Chris Rock said, you don't get a cookie for doing something you're supposed to do.
Right.
Well, after a congressional hearing, and you decide, okay, maybe we're going to start flagging news articles and tweets that aren't accurate. You don't get a cookie for that, but that's a good start.
Well,
and
whatever
I think
it takes these days. Seriously, I mean.
Oh, absolutely,
I'll give you a cookie. Just make it happen, please.
Yeah, exactly. I'll give you a cookie. Well, I think it goes back to what we were saying about TikTok earlier, about them placing time limit controls on things, because they're starting to realize that if they don't do it, somebody else will. And so I think the question of breaking up Facebook comes down to whether this is a good start, but you've got a long way to go before we get to that point where we may have to do that. So again, that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I think that the next couple months obviously are going to be interesting as far as people's engagement with media. But so while we're on the subject, we talked about engaging with media, and kind of one of the final thoughts of this, because I talked about how COVID has impacted this situation. And what I think is really interesting, again, taking it in the context of how younger people are engaging more with technology, or more comfortable with technology, how younger people are more used to digital peer groups and having a lot of their conversation being digital. It's fascinating that I think a lot of our kids did a better job with the transition back in March, when everything was on lockdown and everybody's on quarantine and school stopped and people stopped going to work. And I think that the upside to their embracing technology was that they adapted better to the quarantines and the separations in a way that some of us are still struggling with, 4 months later. So they had a head start on us because they were used to the digital communication media, and the rest of us are trying to figure out, how to still survive via Zoom and still how to get that contact. And so they were ahead of us. Now, the problem though is it has also greatly accelerated some of the technology engagement concerns that we had raised before, because now they're going to digital school, and when digital school is over, well, now they're playing video games, making TikTok videos, and having their social interaction being digital. So what it's done is it's increased the screen time, again, with mental health benefits, but also with concerns that we have to just kind of be aware of. And I think the key is to be aware of it. And I guess I would say with a lot of the things that I present, I don't expect these to be the answers, but I want to get people, thinking about it, doing their own Google search, citations needed, consider your sources, but just kind of being aware of it. And again, just kind of as the closing thought, let's take privacy seriously, because it's not just about whether somebody's reading your email. It's about whether it stifles what makes us, not only as a country, but as a race and a species, important, our creativity and our innovation. And once we start killing privacy and we start worrying about the free exchange of information, we lose all of that.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that, I'm an emergency physician and I travel for work. And so when I went on lockdown in March, I was sequestered away from my family for 11 weeks in a hotel room up in Cleveland. And if I hadn't
you had me in Cleveland.
Well, it didn't matter because I was in a hotel room and I couldn't go anywhere anyway. So, but if I hadn't had Facebook or those kind of interactions, I would have had no physical contact with any of my friends, or not physical, but no contact with my friends. I mean, I was working because I'm a frontline provider, but I couldn't socialize really in any way, and so that was really sort of a sanity saver, and in many ways it provides so many benefits to folks who can't get out, who to give them that connection with others. So it's kind of hard to accept that it is such a trade-off.
No, absolutely. And so the answer is not to run away from technology.
Right.
And as we've talked about before, as you and I have talked about before, part of the problem with technology is like any other addiction. If you have a drug addiction, an alcohol addiction, a gambling addiction, you can find ways to physically distance yourself from those things. But if technology is your problem, too bad. You still have to you have to engage with technology. You use it for work, school, whatever. There's no way to get away from it. And again, I'm the one who's telling everybody you got to be careful with it. But it's a large part of what I do. So I think it's just all about reminding people there needs to be a balance.
Yep. And
just remember, privacy and moderation, and then also considering the source. And I think that's the worst thing too. I think we've gotten lazy and we don't check our sources.
Well, that's a really good point, and that's a good note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your assistance with this topic. Do you have any shameless plugs that you want to take a moment to do?
No shameless plugs, except I'm so proud of the work that you guys on Skeptrack are doing, and the fact that you're having the virtual Dragoncon. My plan is, in the spirit of Dragoncon, to try to stay awake until 3 o'clock in the morning and watch some Crew Shadow videos on YouTube. That's going to be my thing. And then I also said that when I see you again next year, I have your little ninja for you.
Oh,
and hopefully we will all be back together next year. But again, I applaud the work that you guys are doing, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.
Oh, thank you so much. I really give everybody a hug for me. I really hope that we get to see you next year. I have low expectations, but I have high hopes. So.
Absolutely. Take care, Dr. Angie.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye, Derek.
Bye.
So, and thank you so much.
As fun as all this streaming content is, we sincerely cannot wait to see you all in person again next year. Remember to stay healthy and safe until then. Wear a mask when interacting with other people out in the real world. Want more Skeptrack? Get more than 10 years of Skeptics track programming at our video archive, video.skeptrack.org.